Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I am the chief economist at American Compass. And if we could please get an air horn, Sam and Drew. That's right. It is Book Week. Our new book, The New Conservatives, is out Tuesday, June 3rd. It is a compendium of a lot of the classic and best work from American Compass's first 5 years. Stuff we've written, stuff others have written for us, that I think really does the best possible job presenting what on earth is going on the new right. What is the new economic thinking? How does this fit into the politics? And if you are already a committed member of the new right, you will treasure this wonderful volume. Perhaps more importantly, if you are curious about and wondering what on earth is going on in the Republican Party and the conservative movement, I think this is the best explanation you can find. So I hope you will buy a copy. And I hope you will enjoy the conversation we have today with Matthew Continetti, who is Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and author of his own fantastic book on the ideology of conservatism called The Right, the 100-Year War for American Conservatism. He, I think probably better than just about anybody, understands what has been happening on conservatism, the different strains of thinking, what is truly new, what is simply coming back again. And so we had a really great conversation about some of the foundations of the Reagan coalition, how that contributed to the ideology of the Republican Party in the 90s and early in the 21st century, and then what's going on now and how to understand that fitting in. So an appropriate conversation to put our book, The New Conservatives, in context. If you have not read The Right, definitely go pick that up as well. And I think you'll find it a really good way of thinking about a lot of what's going on in our politics. But before we get to that, I have to tell you, of course, about what's going on at Commonplace. Our very own Drew Holden had a terrific review of Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson's Original Sin. And quite by accident, it is something of an anti-AI week as well. We had Brad Littlejohn and Jared Hayden on the need to ask more questions before embedding AI in schools. And Aaron Wren had a really good piece on why data centers aren't the good investments that we need in a lot of communities. So check that out. And of course, subscribe to Understanding America, my Substack, where I find myself having to explain to people this week that no, economics is not like physics. Didn't think we'd have to explain that, but apparently there is passionate views on the other side of it. So subscribe at understandingamerica.co. Go buy The New Conservatives. And here is Matthew Continetti. And we are joined by scholar of the right, Matt Continetti. How are you, sir?
I'm well, Oren. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for doing this. We are promoting our book, but you have your book, which I think is a far more comprehensive look at the conservative movement, certainly. And I thought it would just be interesting to talk a little bit about what you see going on today in conservatism, how that compares to prior rounds of renewal or realignment. And so I guess I would start here. To what extent is what's going on now in American conservatism something that strikes you as truly unique, or does it feel like, oh, we've been here before, we've seen this one?
Well, I think it depends on what dimension of contemporary politics we're addressing. I would say that Donald Trump is unique. I don't think there's any way to describe him other than
one of
unique.
One.
Right, one of one. And so much of what surrounds Donald Trump is an extension of his personality, his effect on different groups, and that is unique. There have always been charismatic leaders in American politics. There have been a couple of charismatic leaders in American conservatism, though in the past century of American conservatism is not, associated with dynamic, charismatic personalities, Ronald Reagan accepted. But that type of very charismatic, very polarizing personality, able to command large audiences, able to put his personal stamp, not just on a party, but on a political movement. That is unique to Donald Trump. Some of the more wonky policy debates we're having, well, I think those different sides in those arguments, which I'm sure we'll get into, whether it's trade, industrial policy, immigration, those debates aren't so new to American conservatism. But Trump is.
Yeah. No, that's a fair point. It's funny because the term I always see thrown around is sort of traditional conservatism, and everyone on all sides sort of makes the case that well, whatever it is that they're doing is the traditional conservatism, which I guess invites the question: is there a traditional conservatism? But if you were telling the story of where the center of gravity was in the American right of center, in conservatism, which aren't necessarily the same thing at all times. We can skip the first half of the 20th century, but at least second half of the 20th century and now into the 21st, what would you pick as the through line versus the deviations? Is the kind of Reagan consensus the center and it's gone both sides from there? Was there something pre-Reagan that's the center and Reagan deviates and now we're deviating a different direction? How would you draw kind of the median versus the tails of the distribution?
Sure. Well, when I look back at history, I divide it into periods. And so I think the type of conservatism in the United States that I grew up with, that you knew, I really would describe as post-Cold War conservatism. So it's the form of the right in America that emerged out of the ashes of the Soviet Union. So the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. We get a preview of what's to come with the debates around the first Gulf War in 1990, 1991. Then at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. And from the 1992 cycle, basically to the 2016 cycle, the mainstream of American conservatism was, I think, for lack of a better word, globalist, right? It believed that America should be the world leader. It believed in American military intervention abroad. It believed in free trade. It believed in legal immigration, and in many instances took a blind eye to illegal immigration as well. And so that was the conservatism you could associate with Newt Gingrich in 1994, very technologically oriented, very future oriented, where our dynamic economy is going to lift all boats. You're supporting NAFTA against many of the Democrats in the Congress, but with the Democrat president, Bill Clinton. And in the turn of the millennium, with the George W. Bush administration, you had some of that, but you also kind of had George Bush's compassionate conservatism, which was, well, we're going to modify for the perceived excesses of the Gingrichites in the 1990s, and so we're going to expand Medicare with the prescription drug benefit. We're going to expand the federal role in education with the No Child Left Behind. We're going to amnesty illegal immigrants, even though that didn't work out. But we're also going to privatize Social Security with personal accounts. That didn't work out either. But that sort of American conservatism, which continues on and I think includes Paul Ryan's roadmap for the American future after the financial crisis, and then really kind of culminates in the Romney campaign of 2012, which of course you were associated with, comes to an end in 2016. And between 2016 and 2024, I think you saw that there was a fight within the party, within the Republican Party, less of a fight within the conservative movement, which moved pretty quickly to support Trump and MAGA after he won the first time. But within the Republican Party, there was still a fight during those 8 years, 2016 to 2024, over, well, can we reconstitute the Gingrich, Bush, McCain, Romney party? And I think 2024 showed that it's impossible to do that. The world has changed, the country has changed, the Republican Party has changed. And so if you ask me what's the turning point in the story I just told, I would say the end of the Cold War from 1989 to 1991.
Yeah. Well, it's a really interesting pivot point, because I totally agree that you sort of see in the post-Cold War period, the Republican Party, the conservative movement, sort of focus of conservatism look very different. The confusing element, or maybe even the irony, is that if you ask those folks what they were doing, they would say Reaganism. Like the North Star was in fact a claim that they were adhering to and carrying out the vision, ideology, agenda of Ronald Reagan, who of course had developed it in the Cold War context.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how you interpret that. To what extent it was a misinterpretation versus in fact a faithful application to a new era versus maybe a less good faith in some cases, kind of attempt to claim the mantle of something that had worked very well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Of course, Reagan was a political leader who, like all political leaders, managed a coalition. And so after he leaves office in 1989, the stage is dominated by the Bush dynasty. And really, actually, the Bush candidacies, whether it's of the father, H.W., in 1992, or one of the sons, Jeb, in 2016, kind of bookend the era that I'm talking about. And we went into the 90s. As a historian, when I did my research for my book, what you find is that in the early 1990s, even really 1994 and the Republican takeover of the Congress led by Newt Gingrich, Reagan had kind of been neglected. I mean, Grover Norquist was leading the Reagan legacy campaign, trying to, rename airports and parks and benches after Reagan. But Reagan, as a political figure, was little studied, not very well understood. In fact, in 1999, Edmund Morris, the famous biographer of Theodore Roosevelt, publishes his biography of Ronald Reagan, Dutch, and it's a scandal in literary circles because Ronald Reagan so mystified Edmund Morris that he had to create essentially a fictional character in this biography. And Dutch is at times very good book, also at other times a maddening and strange book because it's alternation between fact and kind of these imagined fictional interludes. So Reagan was kind of either kind of neglected or just kind of misunderstood. In the 1990s, though, as a fight over the direction of the conservative movement in the Republican Party took place, a group of conservatives who had worked in the Reagan administration, they began espousing what they called neo-Reaganism, or what their version of Reagan, what they saw as the best parts of Reagan. And that turned into being a very influential concept, especially on the foreign policy of George W. Bush II, his administration from 2001 to 2008. I think that neo-Reaganism captures a lot of Reagan, including his patriotism, including his belief in American exceptionalism, including his belief in American leadership in the world stage. But there are also another side of Reagan that the neo-Reaganites disagreed with at the time in the 1980s and then kind of excised from their version of Reaganism. Reagan had a very complicated foreign policy. He rarely used military intervention. He deployed troops once in Grenada. There was also, of course, earlier, I should say twice, the Lebanon mission, but then he extracted them very quickly from Lebanon once it went south and once the Marine barracks was destroyed. So 2 times in the 1980s, deployed ground troops. And then he did rely on punitive strikes. So he ordered the military to strike Libya on several occasions, led then by Colonel Gaddafi. And then there was the so-called tanker war with Iran in the late 80s. But otherwise, Reagan really kind of hewed to the foreign policy of his defense secretary, Caspar Weinberger, who was a realist and who is not interested in entangling America overseas. Right. So well, my point is that Reaganism is kind of in the eye of the beholder, and a certain form of Reaganism predominated for a couple decades.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add, on the foreign policy side, your point about realism, when Reagan was intervening or executing his foreign policy, it was not necessarily on behalf of a vision of sort of global democracy and human rights. That was, in the Cold War context, that meant different things, but that sort of orientation that you saw in the W. Bush administration was also very different, even to the extent that you
right.
did want to deploy force.
Yeah, I think I would differ slightly. I'd say if you look at the Westminster speech where Reagan lays out the institutions that Doge is now in the process of rolling back, whether that's the National Endowment for the Democracy or the International Republican Institute and the International Democratic Institute, right? Reagan did have a vision that democracy was the best form of government.
Yep.
But he also said, and I think this is important in that speech, he said that democracy is not just majority rule. And he used the phrase infrastructure of democracy. You need more than free elections. You need labor unions. He actually mentioned that in the speech. And he talked about free press. He talked about a system of constitutional rule of law. So he definitely believed that democracy was the best form of government. Where I think the distinction would have been with George W. Bush is that I don't really see Reagan ever saying in his presidency, it is the stated goal of U.S. foreign policy to bring about the end of tyranny. You know, Bush didn't say he was going to do it next Tuesday, but he did lay that out as an ultimate goal for American foreign policy. I'm not sure Reagan's speechwriters, his cabinet, Nancy, would have ever let him say something similar to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the labor union, so the labor union point's a fascinating example because the infrastructure of democracy, there's a way in which it also overlaps with the concept of the infrastructure of markets. And, you know, this is a point that I always make to folks who sort of see the conservative view of markets as being a fairly sort of fundamental, you know, the market just is. And I say, you know, we had a bout with thinking democracy just is, but generally speaking, I would say that more traditional conservatism recognizes that when you say democracy, you don't literally mean, all right, let's just go have a vote. You're talking about a system of institutions, of, you know, counter-majoritarian institutions in some cases, civil society, et cetera, that, you know, checks and balances that all together create a strong system of government. And that likewise, when it comes to markets, when you say we love the free market, that's absolutely true, but that embedded within that is a whole set of stuff besides just kind of, well, two people exchanging things in the woods is a market. What else do you need to know? I'm curious, where would you put kind of the center of gravity and conservatism on the thinking about markets? Like even Reagan is obviously a conflicted figure in some respects. You know, the Cato Institute called him the greatest protectionist since Herbert Hoover. But he was also, you know, certainly rhetorically and sometimes in policy, a huge advocate of free trade. If you want to say, no, the traditional conservatism thinks X about markets, what is X?
Yeah, well, I mean, American conservatism since the 1920s, which is kind of my period of study the last 100 years, has been pro-market. That is to say, pro-enterprise, pro-economic freedom, pro-competition choice. The Republican Party has been pro-business up until pretty recently, which is, of course, slightly different than pro-market. There have always been, I think, kind of, you know, political reality affecting these stated goals. So like you say, Reagan, of course, came up with the concept of NAFTA in his 1980 campaign. He talked about a North American Union in his speech declaring his candidacy in that campaign. He was a theoretical free trader. In some of his early books, if you go into his library, like one of his biographers, Lee Edwards, did early on, 1965, saw that he had like Cobden, Richard Cobden, and other kind of pro-free traders from the 19th century. And Reagan read these books. He underlined them. But of course, politics and conservative politics in particular should not be a politics of theory. Conservative politics should be the politics of reality. And the reality is when these figures come into office does not conform to what theorists have written down on books, even if they're very great books. And so, like you suggest, Reagan kind of modified his policies, especially when the Japanese car industry was threatening a lot of the U.S. firms. So I would say, theoretically, American conservatism has been pro-individual, pro-economic freedom, pro-market, understood to be, some arrangement where there is private property, the price system, competition, free allocation of labor. But within politics, and in the Republican Party in particular, they have not always lived up to those stated ideals because living in a democracy as we do, living in a special interest democracy as we do, sometimes many times, they have not lived up to their stated principles.
Yeah. So one more dimension, then I guess we're almost up to today in many senses, and what's happening next. But I guess another dimension to all of this is the sort of other institutions of conservatism, the think tanks, the publications, and so forth. Many of what are today the main conservative establishment institutions, I would say, either were founded or kind of came of age and established their orientation during that Reagan era. And so, as you're sort of describing of the different post-Cold War conservatism, you, for the most part, still have what would have been very recognizable as the set of publications and institutions of the late 70s, early 80s operating in that space. And to a significant extent, still to this day, and with a lot of the same donor infrastructure and so forth. I guess what I wonder is, do you feel like that has that changed in the same way that the political conservatism has changed, or would you tell a different story there?
I do think it's changed, and I think the changes come very recently. So maybe the way I would answer you is to suggest this: most of the major institutions associated with the conservative movement were created in either two periods, one of two periods. The first was in the aftermath of in the beginning, during, and the aftermath of the New Deal and World War II. And those institutions, which were set up, including the institution where I work, the American Enterprise Institute, they were set up to oppose Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal and the growth of government, the centralism, the bureaucracy, Roosevelt's war with the Constitution, right? They were set up to combat Roosevelt on one hand, and then they were set up to fight communism on the other. So kind of New Deal during the 30s, fight communism after World War II. And that was the synthesis or fusion, if you will, of American conservatism. We wanted to roll back the welfare state here in the United States, and we wanted to defeat communism abroad. And the second period of institution building happened in the kind of late 60s, 1970s period. And so that's when you get the American Conservative Union, CPAC. That's when you get the Heritage Foundation, 1973. And you get some of the other kind of what you might call the special interest groups on the right, National Right to Work, the National Right to Life Committee, right? The NRA has been around for a long time, but there were also other Second Amendment groups which were founded in the 1970s, usually to oppose rulings that were coming from the bureaucracy or the judiciary that had not been rolled back by the earlier conservative movements. So those institutions, many of them remain in place today. But I believe in the last 4 years, some of the most prominent have changed in order to cope and to deal with the new political reality of what it means to have a working class Republican Party, what it means to have young conservatives who did not grow up in the Cold War, in fact, did not grow up during the War on Terror, have no real memory of George W. Bush. The truth is, the college students I teach today, their first memories when they were 12 years old were of Obama fighting Trump. That's politics to them, right? So this new generation, they have a very different understanding of right and left than I do. Okay, or certainly people older than me have. So some of the legacy institutions have changed to accommodate this new reality. And then there have been other institutions that have sprung up, right? And so whether it's American Compass or whether it's AFPI, whether it's Center for American Renewal, what we have now in D.C. is an infrastructure to support this changing conservative movement in the Trump era. It's an infrastructure that was not present when Donald Trump first came on the stage in 2015 and won the presidency the first time in 2016. I think it's the existence of that infrastructure, in addition to Trump's experiences over the last 8 years, his new personnel in his second term, that have made this term, we're still not much farther out than 100 days plus into it, but it made this term run much differently than the first term.
Yeah. No, that's definitely my experience as well, and I think it was, much of the more recent infrastructure grew up in response to that experience of the first term. I mean, I always tell people in terms of the sort of the origin story of American Compass to a significant extent is seeing, in late 2019, you're almost at the end of the first Trump term, and yet it is still a landscape of institutions that mostly sort of have their heads down saying this too shall pass.
Yeah.
And that whether you believe Trump was ever going to be in office again or not, if you wanted the conservative movement to look different than it had, there was going to have to be some new institutions on the scene. It does create a very interesting milieu, I suppose, at the moment, where you have, I would say probably, and I'm curious what you think, in a way that's fairly unique, just much more kind of dispersion in the points of views and projects and goals of groups that are all on the right of center and are all claiming the mantle of conservatism. And so, I think as you started out, anything with about Trump in particular is sort of somewhat unique at the moment. But putting him to the side, it seems to me that the state of the ecosystem today is quite unique, even compared to prior periods of change. Like, would it be fair to say that there was a lot more consensus in the kind of Goldwater-Buckley transformation of the party into what became the Reagan Party, that was that there was more continuity maybe in that process than what we're seeing today? Or is this like, no, this is what the movement goes through every few decades?
Yeah. Well, the way I'd answer it is to suggest that it's really kind of the media and technological landscape that has changed rather than the political views of the American people. So in National Review and Buckley lore, of course, we always talk about his fight with the John Birch Society. The fight is not as pat and kind of straight and narrow as it's often told. But Buckley felt that the conspiracy theorizing had no place in his conservatism. And more importantly, if his conservatism were to be associated with conspiracy theories that said that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist, it would go nowhere. And thus there would be no spokesperson for American conservatism in the mainstream of society, because at that time, the mid-century moment, well, you had to go through these regulated channels. There were only 3 networks. There was only 1 national newspaper. There was radio, but there was no nationwide radio syndication like we had beginning with the success of the Rush Limbaugh show in the late 1980s. So it was a real threat, and he had to fight it. Of course, what he always found was that every time he lobbed a missile at the John Birch Society, he was also hitting his own subscribers. And so he was alienating some of the people who also enjoyed William F. Buckley Jr. What we have today is we have a media landscape, a technological landscape that is completely open. But at the same time, we're all shut in one room together. So you have every single imaginable worldview, from Andrew Tate to David Brooks, right? But we're all locked in the same room because we're all using the same platforms: X, YouTube, podcasts, Instagram, to communicate. And so what that does result in, as you suggest, is this kind of bewildering landscape, right? Where the most important commodity one can possess is the ability to win someone's attention. And Trump can win attention in a whole variety of ways. He is a Superman of getting your attention. Other people find that the way that they get your attention is by saying outlandish things, by trafficking in conspiracy theories, by toying with anti-Semitism, right? And others develop their own audiences by providing some value, whether that's perspective or entertainment, right? The rise of the comics, for example. So that's kind of what we have today. I would say that you will always have this range of positions in America, but what's different is now every position has a megaphone, and any position can attract enough people and go viral in order to command the attention, not just of an audience, but of the national discourse for at least a couple days at a time.
So what does that mean for the future? I mean, the nice thing, I guess, about the more controlled system was you could kind of look around and pretty quickly figure out who was in charge, for lack of a better term. You know, today, I think you said earlier, and this is my impression as well, that with Trump's win in 2024, that was a certain kind of narrowing of the set of likely outcomes. I often point to even just, like, I think at 5 p.m. on election night, you probably could have still found people saying, well, they should have nominated Nikki Haley, like, think how much better she'd be doing. And by midnight, that was pretty much over, partly because he had won, he'd swept the swing states. I think even more because of how well he had done elsewhere. The 15, 20-point swings with younger non-white men in urban areas I always point out, like, New York and Illinois are now closer than Florida and Texas. Like, there was a sense that, oh no, there really is somewhere further to go in this direction, in a way that the prior coalition probably had run its course. Mm-hmm. So how would you sort of describe the bounds of plausible outcomes now going forward? I mean, there is going to be a day after Trump in the not that distant future, relative to how long we've now been in this period of disarray. What do you see as the kind of plausible set of outcomes? Or do you already have your locked and loaded prediction of exactly what's going to happen?
No, I don't. I try to avoid predictions as best I can. But, I'll look at it. I'll say this. Earlier in this conversation, we were talking about how in the 1990s, everybody on the right at a certain point decided, well, we have to get right with Reagan. Right? Are we going to be neo-Reaganites? Are we going to say that I'm the real Ronald Reagan conservative, as was the case in 2008 and 2012 primaries, right? Everyone wanted to get right with Reagan. And I do believe that 4 years from now, 8 years from now, 12 years from now, Republicans will be saying they want to get right with Trump. Not least because Donald Trump will remain the most powerful politician in America until the day he dies. Until he can no longer tweet, he will exercise a degree of authority over the Republican Party and over the national debate that few ever hold. The closest precedent, I think, is Theodore Roosevelt. After he left office, of course, he ran as the Bull Moose in 1912. That didn't work out. But for the next 10 years, until he dies, he is still talking about, not quite 10 years. He died before that, but until his death, he's still exercising some influence over the Republican Party. People are paying attention to Theodore Roosevelt, and that's just one of the similarities between Theodore Roosevelt and Donald Trump. So he'll still be there, and people want to be MAGA. And so the question will be, well, what is MAGA? At the most superficial level, MAGA is just whatever Donald Trump says. At the more theoretical level, there are differences, and we're already seeing this play out, as you all know, with debates between, say, the Bannon populists wing of MAGA and the Elon Musk tech wing of MAGA, whether the question is how to think about AI, what to do about immigration. We're also having another debate now between what you might call MAGA conservatives, say the Mike Johnsons, who, Johnson is MAGA. He was elected in 2016. He's never been far from Trump as one of the keys to success. But he has a different view about how to approach Medicaid. than, say, Senator Hawley, right? More MAGA populist, right? He thinks MAGA is going to mean a welfare state that is more attractive to the working class coalition that Donald Trump brought into being. So you're going to have that argument play out. I think the argument will be pretty sub rosa leading up into 2028, simply because I think, as we speak right now, Vice President Vance has a very commanding position in the Republican primary in 2028. And I at this point, I can't see that really changing, barring some not wanted catastrophe. So I think the debate might be slightly subtle, but it will continue to go on. However, that debate will always be constrained within MAGA. Mm-hmm. We want to make America great again, right? We want to carry on Donald Trump's legacy. The question is how best to do that. And those constraints would not be there had Donald Trump not won in 2024. Then the debate would be very different. And the debate would have been between not just the different iterations of MAGA I described, but also between that MAGA group and then the group saying, we have to go back. We have to go back. We have to turn around. That group now saying we have to go back is very small. And many of them are no longer Republicans to begin with.
Yeah. Well, that was exactly a good segue into my last question about sort of what are the groups that are out, in a sense. Because one thing I think that's striking about some of those debates you were now just describing, which I think very well captured, these different facets of the MAGA coalition. And there's always this kind of, it is the premise of a coalition, kind of, well, who gets what? Everyone has to get something if they're going to be in the coalition. The two groups, if we think back to the Reagan coalition, you sort of had the social conservatives at the core of it in some ways, at least numbers wise, but then you had the free market libertarian folks on the economic side, and you had the Cold War hawks, became the neocons of the post-Cold War period. On the foreign policy side, neither of those groups kind of even makes the cut in some respects as sort of folks who are really participating in the intra-conservative debate, at least in some of the ones that you had highlighted. Do you think that they, and let's talk particularly about kind of the more free market libertarian folks, some of them have already decided they'd rather just be Democrats. Some of them are still hoping we can go back. Some of them are finding their way to making peace with elements of the, you already see them sort of positioning, claiming Trump for themselves in various ways. Where do you think that ends up? Where do the fans of Friedrich Hayek land in American politics at the end of the day?
Well, I think there are plenty of Republicans who remain fans of Friedrich Hayek, and I think they'll continue to be Republicans. The issue is more between kind of the policy wings than any philosophical one. I would just say this, a lot of people have been politically homeless for some time, but that means often that you get into a politics of the least worst alternative. The most important words in life are compared to what? And so there were many people in 2024 who, even though they were wary of Trump's trade agenda, for example, still supported him because of Trump's promise to keep tax rates low, to lessen regulation, to unleash American industry, and basically create a big free trade zone within the United States, right? Which was kind of if you go back, that was kind of the economic policy of the Republican Party for many, many years after its creation, after its formation, was, well, we're going to have the tariff wall, but within the United States, we're going to let everything go, right? You can do what you want, right? And Trump kind of has that same resonance to the way he talks about protection. So when you have that type of situation, you can have this coalition that includes a lot of people who believe in market competition and who believe in a dynamic economy, as well as more populist figures who think, well, the way to increase our share among working class Americans is actually to embrace state power in some regard. I don't really see that debate resolved anytime soon. I think it's just going to continue and continue, because the alternative, the Democratic Party, is not a vehicle for much of anything. What the Democratic Party has to offer right now, it seems, is continued to be kind of wokeism, an extremely heavy-handed state, the social disorder, right? And a foreign policy that kind of alternates between lectures and regime change and total withdrawal from the world. So as long as the Democratic Party is so unappetizing, I think we're kind of stuck with this Republican coalition, this conservative movement, which parts of which still retain an admiration for figures like Hayek, figures like Milton Friedman, Adam Smith. But they're also in conversation with a growing number of people, and especially young people, who think that the realities of the 21st century force us to discard some of the lessons or some of the doctrines that Hayek and Friedman advocated.
Yeah. Now I want to spend a whole half hour talking about the Democratic Party, but we will have to save that for part 2 or maybe the outtakes. This has been terrific. Matthew Continetti, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Oren.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.